There are names history chooses to remember and names it quietly buries. Marie Laveau belongs to that second category, a figure split between two realities. In folklore, she survives as a shadow of the famed Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, but the woman who carried that name in the cotton fields of Mississippi was no mystic icon. She was something far more subversive. She understood that information, observed patiently, guarded fiercely, and released with precision, could crack the illusion of power that enslavers believed was unshakable. What you are about to hear is neither the sanitized narrative fed to school children nor the mystical spectacle sold to tourists on Bourbon Street. It is the version that never reached the history books because it dismantled a comfortable lie that the enslaved waited helplessly for rescue. In truth, they were often the builders of their own escape routes, wielding intelligence as quietly and effectively as any weapon. Marie Laveau, the Mississippi woman whose real story was intentionally blurred by generations of historians, mastered that weapon in ways that changed dozens of lives. In 1839, the Natchez district of Mississippi was a world where wealth was calculated in acres and human lives. The Mississippi River cut through the region like an artery of commerce, sending cotton down to New Orleans and sending prosperity back up to those who claimed dominion over the land. The Beaumont plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of that rich soil, anchored by a white-columned mansion that embodied everything the South wanted to believe about itself: elegance, refinement, tradition. But beneath that facade lay the truth. An economy propped up by the relentless exploitation of 247 men, women, and children who had no say in the fortune they produced. The plantation functioned like its own enclosed kingdom, complete with internal markets, rigid hierarchies, and a carefully calibrated balance of reward and punishment. And within that world, hidden in plain sight, Marie Laveau was quietly reshaping the future in ways the owners could not begin to imagine. At the top sat the Beaumont family, Charles Beaumont, the patriarch who had inherited the land from his father, his wife Eleanor, who managed the household with an iron hand disguised in silk gloves, their eldest son Thomas studying law in Vicksburg with ambitions toward politics, and their younger children, two daughters who were being groomed for advantageous marriages, and a son still in his teens who would eventually inherit the plantation. Below the family came the overseers and managers, men like Cyrus Halt, whose job was to extract maximum productivity from the enslaved population while maintaining enough order to prevent rebellion. Hall was a man in his 40 seconds, lean and weathered, with eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for cruelty tempered only by economic calculation. He understood that damaged property was less valuable, so his punishments were carefully calibrated to inflict pain without reducing work capacity. Below the overseers came the enslaved population itself, divided into hierarchies that reflected the plantation's needs. House slaves, who worked in the main residence, field hands who worked the cotton from planting to harvest, skilled workers like blacksmiths and carpenters, and those with specialized roles like midwives and healers. Into this carefully structured world came Marie Laveau on a Tuesday in March 1839, purchased at auction in Natchez for $850. The auction had taken place in the Forks of the Road, the second largest slave market in the South, where human beings were displayed on platforms and examined like livestock. Marie had stood on. That platform, with her eyes downcast, her posture suggesting submission, while potential buyers assessed her teeth, her hands, her physical condition. The bill of sale described her as healthy, literate, skilled in household management and herb cultivation, approximately 23 years of age, no known defects or vices. That literacy should have raised questions. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Mississippi, punishable by whipping for the slave and fines for anyone who taught them. But Beaumont's purchasing agent, a man named Dalton who handled such transactions, saw only an opportunity. A literate slave who could keep records of medicinal supplies and read receipts for herb orders would be more valuable than one who couldn't. What the bill of sale didn't mention was where Marie had acquired her literacy or why her previous owner, a Louisiana planter named Rousseau, had been so eager to sell her despite her obvious value, there were no references provided, no detailed history, no explanation for why a valuable, skilled slave would be sold at all. Dalton had asked, of course, but Rousseau's agent had been vague. Something about the owner downsizing his operations, needing capital, the usual explanations that might or might not be true. The truth, which Dalton didn't know, and which Marie would never volunteer, was that Rousseau had sold her because he'd become afraid of her, not because she'd done anything overtly rebellious, not because she'd been violent or disobedient, but because he'd begun to notice that things happened around her. Accusations against slaves would mysteriously fall apart. Punishments would be avoided through circumstances that seemed coincidental, but occurred too frequently to be mere chance. Information that should have been secret would somehow become known to people who could use it to their advantage. Rousseau couldn't prove Marie was behind any of it. He'd developed a superstitious dread of her nonetheless, so he'd sold her, taking a loss on the price just to have her gone from his property, and he'd been deliberately vague about her history to ensure the sale went through. Marie arrived at Beaumont Plantation in the back of a wagon, her few possessions wrapped in a cloth bundle. She was assigned to the cabin row behind the main house, a collection of rough wooden structures that housed the domestic slaves. Each cabin held 4 to 6 people with minimal privacy and less comfort. Marie's cabin was slightly better than the field's quarters. It had a wooden floor instead of packed dirt, and a small window that actually had shutters, but it was still a far cry from anything that could be called comfortable. She shared the cabin with 3 other women. Dinah, who was in her 42nds and managed the main house laundry, had been at Beaumont her entire life and knew every detail of the plantation's operations. Rachel, younger and quieter, worked in the kitchen and had a small child who stayed in the nursery cabin during work hours. And Lily, who was around Marie's age and worked as a seamstress, making and mending clothes for both the enslaved population and occasionally for the Beaumont family. That first night, Marie said little. She arranged her few possessions on the narrow shelf above her pallet with careful precision, a small wooden box that contained needles and thread, a cloth bundle of dried plants that gave off a faint medicinal smell, and a leather journal so worn the cover had gone soft as fabric. The journal was her most dangerous possession, and she kept it wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom of her belongings. "You can read?" Danina asked, watching Marie handle the journal. The question was cautious, almost whispered, because literacy was dangerous knowledge. Marie looked at her steadily, assessing how truth to reveal. "I can remember things," she said carefully. "Recipes, remedies, things my grandmother taught me. Sometimes I make marks to help me remember, but I don't know if that counts as reading." It was an answer that wasn't quite an answer, suggesting literacy without claiming it. And Danina recognized the intelligence in that evasion. She nodded slowly. "Best to be careful about what you know and what you don't know," she said. "Bolt doesn't like slaves who are too clever." "I'll remember that," Marie said, and meant that the next morning Marie was taken to meet her primary supervisor, the plantation's head cook, a woman named Patience, who had worked at Beaumont for 30 years and wielded considerable authority in the domestic hierarchy. Patience was a large woman in her 52nds, with hands scarred from decades of kitchen work, and eyes that assessed Marie with the same thoroughness that Dalton had used at the auction, though for different purposes. "You know herbs?" Patience asked. Getting straight to business. "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother was a healer in Louisiana. She taught me which plants help with fever, which ones ease pain, which ones can be made into pusses for wounds. Can you grow them or just use what's already there?" "I can grow them. I know which plants need sun, which need shade, which ones grow well together, and which ones don't." Patience nodded, satisfied. "The herb garden behind the kitchen house has been neglected since old Martha died last year. Nobody else knows enough about plants to keep it properly. That'll be your main work. Tend the garden. Prepare remedies when people are sick. Keep records of what you use so we can account for supplies. You'll also help in the kitchen when we need extra hands, especially during harvest season when we're feeding extra workers." She led Marie to the herb garden, which was indeed in poor condition. Weeds had overtaken M. Ost of the beds and the plants that remained were struggling, but Marie could see the bones of a good garden underneath the neglect. The layout was sensible, with taller plants positioned to provide afternoon shade for those that needed it, and a water barrel positioned to catch rain from the kitchen house roof. "I can work with this," Marie said, already planning in her mind which plants to save, which to remove, what new herbs to cultivate. "You'll have mornings to work the garden," Patience told her. "Afternoons, you'll be available for medical calls. If someone in the quarters is sick, you'll go tend them. Evenings, you'll help in the kitchen. Sundays, you'll have to yourself, except for emergencies." It was a demanding schedule, but Marie had expected nothing less. What mattered was that the work gave her a legitimate reason to move around the plantation, to interact with people from different parts of the operation, to observe and listen and gather information. Over the next few weeks, Marie established herself in her role. She worked the herb garden with systematic efficiency, clearing weeds, amending soil, transplanting struggling plants to better locations. She began to cultivate new herbs from seeds and cutings she'd brought with her. Fever W for headaches, comfrey for wounds, chamomile for stomach ailments, valerian for sleep troubles, willow bark for pain and fever. But more importantly, she began to observe the plantation's operations with the same systematic attention she gave to her garden. She noticed patterns in how decisions were made, how information flowed through the hierarchy, where power was concentrated and where it was diffuse. He noticed, for instance, that Cyrus Hole kept detailed records in the plantation office, ledgers that tracked every bushel of cotton picked, every tool distributed, every punishment administered, every expense and profit. Say ledgers were the nervous system of the plantation's operations, and anyone who understood them would understand how the entire system functioned. She noticed that the Beaumont family's youngest son, Thomas, had a habit of leaving documents scattered around the library when he came home from his law studies in Vicksburg. He was careless with papers, treating them as if they were invisible to the house slaves who cleaned the room, never considering that those slaves might be able to read or might understand the significance of what they saw. She noticed that the house slaves who served at dinner often heard conversations about business dealings, political alliances, debts, and social obligations that the Beaumonts assumed were safe to discuss in front of people they considered invisible. Those conversations contained information that could be valuable to someone who knew how to use it. She noticed that there were tensions within the overseer hierarchy. Halt had 2 assistants, and they competed for his favor and for the possibility of advancement. That competition created opportunities for manipulation, for playing one against the other, for ensuring that information reached or didn't reach particular people. She noticed that the enslaved population itself had complex social networks and hierarchies. There were people who were respected for their skills, people who were trusted with secrets, people who served as informal leaders in the quarters. Understanding those networks would be essential to accomplishing anything. And she noticed that information carefully gathered and strategically shared could change the balance of power in ways that violence never could. Marie began to cultivate relationships with key people in the plantation's social structure. She did this carefully, never pushing, never seeming too interested, just being helpful and observant and gradually ear. Ning trusted with Danina, who managed the laundry and had access to the main house. Marie shared remedies for the arthritis that plagued Dina's hands. In return, Dina shared observations about the Beaumont family's habits, their moods, their concerns. It wasn't presented as intelligence gathering, just the natural conversation of women who worked together and shared living space. With Patience, who supervised the kitchen and heard much of what happened in the main house, Marie proved herself reliable and skilled, becoming someone Patience could depend on. In return, Patience began to trust Marie with more information about the plantation's operations, about upcoming events, about tensions within the Beaumont family. With the field hands, Marie provided medical care that was more attentive than they'd received from the previous herb woman. She treated injuries and illnesses with skill and compassion, and in return they began to come to her not just for physical ailments, but for counsel about other troubles. Within 3 months of her arrival, Marie had established herself as someone valuable, someone trustworthy, someone who saw and heard things, but who seemed to have no agenda beyond doing her work well. And then she began to test her methods. The first test came in late April when a man named Samuel was accused of stealing a ham from the smokehouse. Samuel was a field hand in his 32nd, strong and capable, with a wife named Grace and 2 young children. The accusation came from one of Holt's assistants, a man named Briggs, who was new to the plantation and eager to prove his vigilance. The evidence seemed clear. Samuel had been seen near the smokehouse at an unusual hour late evening after the workday had ended. When the smokehouse was invented the next morning, a ham was missing. A search of the quarters found the ham hidden in a cloth sack near Samuel's cabin, buried under some loose boards. The punishment for theft was typically 20 lashes administered publicly so that the entire enslaved population would witness the consequences of stealing from the master. Sometimes the punishment was more severe if the owner wanted to make a particular example. Samuel maintained his innocence desperately. He swore he'd never taken the ham, never been to the smokehouse that evening, had no idea how the meat had ended up near his cabin. But his word meant nothing against the physical evidence and the testimony of an overseer's assistant. He was locked in the plantation jail, a small brick building near the overseer's house, to await punishment that would come at week's end when the entire enslaved population would be assembled to watch. Marie heard about this on a Wednesday evening when Grace came to her cabin in tears begging for help. He didn't do it. Grace insisted Samuel wouldn't steal. He knows what would happen. He wouldn't risk it, not with the children to think about. Someone's lying or someone made a mistake, but he didn't do it. Marie listened carefully, asking questions.
Who saw him near the smokehouse?
Briggs, the new assistant overseer. He said he saw Samuel walking that direction around dusk. Did anyone else see him? No, just Briggs. And the ham was found near your cabin. Yes, buried under some loose boards behind the cabin, but anyone could have put it there. We don't lock our cabin. Nobody does. Anyone could have hidden it there to make it look like Samuel took it. Marie considered this carefully. Tell me about Briggs. What do you know about him? Grace shook her head. Not much. He's only been here a month. Came from somewhere in Alabama. Holt hired him to replace the assistant who left. He's young, maybe 25, and he's always trying to impress Hull, always looking for problems to solve. Has he had any conflicts with Samuel specifically? Not that I know of. Samuel barely knows him. Marie filed all of this information away, her mind already working through possibilities. I'll see what I can learn, she told Grace. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. Over the next day, Marie began to gather information with systematic precision. She talked to people who worked near the smokehouse, asking casual questions about who'd been around that evening. She talked to people who lived near Samuel's cabin, asking if they'd seen anyone unusual in the area. She paid attention to Briggs, observing his behavior, his interactions with other overseers, his patterns of movement around the plantation, and she discovered something interesting. Briggs had a visitor the week before, a younger man, maybe 20 or 21, who'd arrived on horseback and stayed at the overseer's quarters for 2 nights. Several people had seen him, though nobody knew who he was. He'd left early one morning before most people were awake, heading toward the road that led to Natchez. Marie also discovered that Briggs had been making small errors in the plantation's record-keeping. Nothing major, but enough to suggest either incompetence or deliberate falsification. Cotton weights that didn't quite add up. Tool inventories that were slightly off. Small discrepancies that Hull hadn't noticed yet because Briggs was new and still learning the systems. And she discovered something else. Cyrus Holt's nephew, a young man named James who lived in Vicksburg, had been trying to get a position as an overseer on various plantations in the region. He'd been unsuccessful so far, but he was persistent, and he had a reputation for being willing to do whatever was necessary to prove himself. Marie began to construct a hypothesis. What if the visitor had been James Holt? What if he'd come to visit his uncle and while he was there had taken the ham, not to eat it, but to take? Eat it with him when he left as a gift from his uncle? What if Briggs, knowing about the missing ham and desperate to prove his value to Hull, had decided to frame someone for the theft rather than admit he didn't know what had happened to it? What if he'd chosen Samuel simply because Samuel had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, walking past the smokehouse on his way to somewhere else? It was speculation, but it fit the facts. And more importantly, it suggested a way to create doubt about Samuel's guilt. Marie couldn't confront Briggs or Hull directly. She had no standing, no authority, no voice in the plantation's power structure, but she could plant information in places where it would grow into questions that others would ask. She started with patience. The next morning, while helping in the kitchen, Marie mentioned casually that she'd been gathering herbs near the overseer's quarters the previous week, and had seen a young man leaving early one morning, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Probably just a visitor, Patience said, not particularly interested. Probably, Marie agreed. Though he looked a bit like Mr. Holt, now that I think about it, same build, same way of walking, could have been a relative. Patience's hands paused in the bread dough she was kneading. Hull had a visitor. I don't know for certain, just someone I saw. Might have been nobody important. But the seed was planted. Patience, who was naturally curious and who had her own complicated relationship with the overseer hierarchy, began to wonder. She mentioned it to Diner that evening, just as casual conversation. Diner, who cleaned the overseer's quarters and would have known if there was a visitor, confirmed that yes, someone had stayed there for 2 nights the previous week. Did Hull mention it to Mr. Beaumont? Patience asked. Not that I heard, Denina said. But then why would he? People have visitors all the time. True. Patience agreed, though it's odd that a visitor would leave so early in the morning before breakfast, even almost like he was in a hurry or didn't want to be seen. The information began to circulate through the house slave network, not as accusation, but as curiosity. And because house slaves talked to the Beaumont family members they served, the information eventually reached Eleanor Beaumont, who managed the household accounts and had a sharp mind for details that didn't add up. Eleanor mentioned it to her husband that evening, not as anything important, just as an oddity she'd heard. Did you know Cyrus had a visitor last week? His nephew, apparently, though he didn't mention it. Charles Beaumont frowned. He didn't mention it to me. Probably didn't think it was important. Though the servant said the young man left very early before dawn. Seemed odd to me. Beaumont, who trusted his overseer but also trusted his wife's instincts about household matters, filed the information away. The next day, he mentioned it to Holt casually, just asking if his nephew had visited. Hull, caught off guard, admitted that yes, James had stopped by briefly, just passing through on his way to Natchez. He hadn't mentioned it because it seemed unimportant, just a family visit, nothing to do with plantation business. Of course, Beaumont said, though I do like to know who's on the property, just for security purposes, you understand? Of course, sir, I should have mentioned it. It won't happen again. But the conversation had planted a seed of doubt in Beaumont's mind. Why hadn't Hull mentioned the visit? What else might he not be mentioning? Meanwhile, Marie had been working on another angle. She'd noticed those small discrepancies in Briggs's record-keeping, and she'd mentioned them very carefully to the plantation's bookkeeper, an elderly white man named Porter, they met twice a week to review the accounts. She'd done this while treating Porter for his rheumatism, providing him with a pus that actually helped with the pain. While applying the treatment, she'd mentioned, as if confused, that she'd seen some numbers in the Cotton House records that didn't seem to match what she'd heard people saying about the harvest weights. I'm sure I just misunderstood, she'd said. I don't know much about numbers, but I thought I heard someone say they'd picked 42 bushels, and the record said 40. Probably I just heard wrong. Porter, who was meticulous about accounts, had made a note to check the Cotton House records more carefully. When he did, he found several small discrepancies, nothing major, but enough to suggest that someone was either careless or deliberately falsifying records. He reported this to Beaumont, who asked Holt about it. Holt, who hadn't been aware of the errors, was forced to admit that his new assistant, Briggs, might be making mistakes in the record-keeping. He's still learning the systems, Hull explained. I'll supervise him more closely. But it was another mark against Briggs's credibility, another reason to question his competence. And then Marie played her final card. She arranged for information to reach Beaumont that the smokehouse inventory might not be accurate. She did this through a complex chain. She mentioned to Diner that she'd heard someone say there might be more than one ham missing. Denina mentioned it to Eleanor Beaumont while doing laundry. Eleanor mentioned it to her husband. Beaumont ordered a complete inventory of the smokehouse. When it was done, they discovered that 3 hams were missing, not 1. The ham found near Samuel's cabin was examined more carefully and found to have been cut with a different knife than the plantation issued to the enslaved population, a finer blade, the kind a gentleman might. Suddenly, the case against Samuel looked much less certain. If 3 hams were missing, and if the one found near his cabin had been cut with a different knife, then perhaps Samuel hadn't stolen it at all. Perhaps someone else had taken the hams, possibly Holt's nephew, as a gift from his uncle, and perhaps Briggs, discovering the theft and not wanting to admit he didn't know what had happened, had framed Samuel by planting one of the hams near his cabin. It was all speculation, but it created enough doubt that Beaumont couldn't proceed with the punishment in good conscience. He ordered Samuel released with the explanation that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond doubt. Samuel returned to his family shaken but unharmed. Briggs was reprimanded for the errors in his record-keeping and told to be more careful in his accusations. Holt was instructed to inform the plantation management of any future visitors to his quarters, and Marie, who had orchestrated the entire sequence of events with nothing but careful observation and strategic conversation, continued tending her herbs as if nothing had happened. But word spread through the enslaved community, not in any obvious way, but through the subtle communication networks that connected people across the plantation. Within days, people understood that Marie Laveau was someone who saw things, who understood how the machinery of power worked, and who knew how to insert small pieces of information into that machinery to change its output. They began coming to her, not just for remedies for their bodies, but for something else. The second case came in June when a woman named Clara was threatened with sale. Clara was in her late 20s, a skilled seamstress who made clothes for both the enslaved population and occasionally for the Beaumont family. She had a daughter, 8 years old, who worked in the main house, a helper to the cook. The threat of sale came because Charles Beaumont had accumulated debts from a failed cotton speculation scheme. He'd invested heavily in cotton futures, betting that prices would rise, but instead they'd fallen. And now he owed money to several creditors. One of those creditors, a man named Garrett, who owned a plantation in Louisiana, had offered to forgive part of the debt in exchange for several slaves, including Clara. Garrett had a reputation throughout the region as a brutal owner. Stories circulated about slaves who'd been sold to his plantation and had died within months from overwork and mistreatment. Being sold to Garrett was considered only slightly better than being sold to the Deep South plantations where conditions were even worse. Clara came to Marie in desperation. "They're going to sell me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Beaumont told Hole to prepare papers for me and 3 others. We're being sold to Garrett in Louisiana to settle a debt. My daughter will stay here. They're separating us. Please, Marie. I know you helped Samuel. Please help me." Marie listened carefully, her mind already working through the problem. This was more complex than Samuel's case. This involved the Beaumont family's finances directly, not just an overseer's mistake. The stakes were higher and the potential for failure was greater. "Tell me everything you know about this debt," Marie said. "How much does Mr. Beaumont owe? When is the sale supposed to happen? What do you know about Garrett?" Over the next several days, Marie gathered information from multiple sources. She learned that Beaumont owed Garrett approximately $3,000, a significant sum. She learned that the sale was scheduled for the end of the month, giving her less than 3 weeks to find a solution. She learned that Garrett was indeed as brutal as his reputation suggested, and he was also involved in several questionable business dealings that had made him enemies among other planters in the region. Most importantly, she learned that Thomas Beaumont, the lawyer's son, had recently been hired to represent another planter named Whitfield in a land dispute case. And she learned that Garrett was the opposing party in that dispute. Thomas was literally working against Garrett in a legal case while his father was negotiating to sell slaves to the man. This was the leverage Marie needed. She began to construct a plan that would make the sale socially and professionally awkward for the Beaumont family. She couldn't stop the sale through direct intervention. She had no power to do that, but she could make the cost of proceeding with the sale higher than the benefit of settling the debt. First, she needed to ensure that information about the sale reached Thomas Beaumont, who might not know about his father's negotiations with Garrett. She did this through the house slave network. Information passed from Clara to Dina to the house butler, who mentioned it to Thomas during one of his visits home from Vicksburg. Thomas was indeed unaware of the sale, and he was troubled by it. Selling slaves to a man he was actively working against in court created a conflict of interest that could damage his professional reputation. He mentioned this concern to his father, but Charles Beaumont was in a difficult financial position and didn't see an alternative. The debt had to be paid, and Garrett's offer was the most convenient solution. Marie needed to create an alternative solution, one that would be more attractive than selling to Garrett. She began to gather information about Beaumont's other creditors and about potential sources of capital that might allow him to pay the debt without selling slaves. This required accessing information that was normally well beyond her financial records, business correspondence, details of transactions that were discussed only in private conversations. She did this through a combination of careful observation and strategic questioning. She listened to conversations overheard by house slaves. She examined documents that Thomas left scattered in the library, reading them quickly. When she delivered herbs to the main house, she talked to slaves from other plantations who came to Beaumont for various reasons, gathering information about business dealings and financial situations across the region. And she discovered something useful. Another planter named Prescott, who owned a plantation about 20 miles away, had recently come into significant capital through the sale of land. Prescott was looking for investment opportunities, and he had a long-standing rivalry with Garrett that made him inclined to work against Garrett's interests whenever possible. Marie couldn't approach Prescott directly. She was a slave, and he would never take a business proposition from her seriously. But she could ensure that information about Beaumont's financial situation reached Prescott through channels that would make it seem like a business opportunity rather than a desperate plea for help. She did this through a complex chain of communication. She mentioned to a slave named Peter, who worked for a merchant family in Natchez, that she'd heard the Beaumont family was looking for alternative financing for some business debts. Peter mentioned this to his owners, who mentioned it in casual conversation to other merchants. The information eventually reached Prescott through his own business network. Prescott, who was indeed looking for investment opportunities and who disliked Garrett, saw an opportunity to both make money and undermine his rival. He approached Beaumont with an offer. He would provide a loan at favorable terms to Paul, off the debt to Garrett, and in exchange, Beaumont would give him a share in the next cotton harvest and would use Prescott's cotton broker for future sales. Beaumont, seeing an opportunity to settle his debt without selling slaves and without dealing with Garrett, accepted the offer. The sale was canceled, and Clara remained at Beaumont Plantation with her daughter. Clara never knew the full extent of what Marie had done to save her. She knew only that the sale had been canceled, that she and her daughter would not be separated, and that somehow, impossibly, things had worked out. But others in the enslaved community began to understand that Marie Laveau was operating on a level of sophistication that went far beyond simple luck or coincidence. She was manipulating the plantation's power structure with a precision that suggested deep understanding of how that structure functioned, and they began to come to her with increasingly complex problems. By the fall of 1840, Marie had established herself as a figure of quiet authority in the quarters. People came to her not just for medicine, but for counsel about problems that seemed unsolvable. A man whose wife had been threatened with sale to another plantation. A woman whose son had been falsely accused of breaking a valuable tool. A couple who wanted to marry but knew the overseer would separate them out of spite because the man had once challenged his authority. Marie listened to all of them. She asked questions that seemed irrelevant. Who had been present when the accusation was made? What other events had happened that day? What conversations they'd overheard? What patterns they'd noticed in the overseer's behavior or the Beaumont family's decisions? And then, with patience that seemed infinite, she would begin to work. She never did anything directly. She never confronted anyone with power, never made accusation. Never put herself at risk. Instead, she would plant information, The way she planted seeds in her garden carefully in the right soil at the right time, and then she would wait for it to grow. Each intervention followed a similar pattern. First, gather information from multiple sources to understand the full context of the problem. Second, identify leverage points, places where small amounts of information could create large changes in outcome. Third, plant that information through trusted intermediaries who would pass it along without knowing its ultimate purpose. Fourth, wait for the information to work its way through the system and create the desired change. Fifth, remain invisible throughout the entire process so that no one could trace the outcome back to her involvement. It was a method that required patience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of human psychology and social systems. Marie had all three. When a man named Joseph was accused of laziness and threatened with punishment, Marie discovered that the accusation came from Briggs, the assistant overseer, who was still trying to prove his worth after the Samuel incident. She also discovered that Briggs had been making errors in the cotton weight records, small discrepancies that suggested either incompetence or deliberate theft. She mentioned these discrepancies to the plantation bookkeeper during a visit to treat his rheumatism, framing it as innocent confusion about numbers she'd seen. The bookkeeper investigated, found the errors, and reported them to Beaumont. Briggs was dismissed, and Joseph's supposed laziness was forgotten in the larger scandal of the falsified records. When a woman named Ruth was being pressured by one of the Beaumont family's visiting relatives, Marie discovered information about the man's debts and gambling habits. She ensured that this information reached the man's wife through a complex chain of gossip that made it seem like common knowledge rather than deliberate revelation. The wife confronted her husband, who left the plantation in disgrace, and Ruth was safe. When a couple named Daniel and Esther wanted to marry but knew the overseer would separate them, Marie discovered that the overseer had been skimming supplies from the plantation stores and selling them in Natchez for personal profit. She ensured that evidence of this theft reached Beaumont through the bookkeeper. The overseer was dismissed, and the new overseer who replaced him had no objection to Daniel and Esther's marriage. Each intervention was small, almost invisible. But together they began to create something larger, a sense among the enslaved population that they were not entirely powerless, that there were ways to resist that didn't require violence or escape. That information and intelligence could be weapons as powerful as any physical force. Marie became a legend in the quarters, though not in any obvious way. People didn't talk about her openly, didn't attribute specific outcomes to her intervention, but they understood that she was someone who could help, someone who saw patterns that others missed, someone who understood how to work within the system to change outcomes. And that kind of influence, even when exercised subtly, eventually attracts dangerous attention. Cyrus Hull was not a stupid man. He had been an overseer for 15 years, working on plantations across Mississippi and Louisiana, and he had learned to recognize patterns in slave behavior that suggested potential trouble. He knew the signs of rebellion, secret meetings, whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, unusual movements at night, weapons being hidden or made. But Marie Laveau didn't fit any of those patterns. She didn't hold secret meetings. She didn't whisper conspiratorially. She'd die. Didn't move around at unusual hours or show any interest in weapons or escape. She simply tended her garden, prepared her remedies, and went about her work with quiet efficiency. Yet things kept happening around her. Accusations fell apart. Punishments were avoided. His own authority was undermined in ways he couldn't quite trace back to any single source. And when he paid attention, he noticed that Marie seemed to be present at the edges of many of these situations, not directly involved, but somehow connected. By the summer of 1840, Hull had begun to watch Marie with increasing attention. He couldn't prove anything. She was too careful for that. But suspicion doesn't require proof, and Hull's suspicion grew with each incident that seemed to work out too conveniently for the enslaved population. He began to ask questions. He talked to other overseers, asking if they'd noticed anything unusual about Marie. He watched her movements, noting where she went and who she talked to. He tried to find evidence of wrongdoing, hidden documents, secret meetings, anything that would justify punishment. But Marie had anticipated this. She'd known from the beginning that success would eventually draw attention, and she'd prepared for it. She became even more careful, even more circumspect in her movements and conversations. She stopped intervening in situations where the risk was too high, focused on smaller matters, things that wouldn't draw direct attention. She also began to cultivate a reputation for being simple and superstitious, someone who believed in folk remedies and old stories, but who had no real understanding of the plantation's power structure. She would occasionally say things that sounded naive or confused, ask questions that suggested she didn't understand how decisions were made, present herself as someone who was skilled with plants but not particularly intelligent. In other ways, it was a performance carefully calibrated to make her seem less threatening than she actually was, and it worked to a degree. Holt remained suspicious, but he couldn't find evidence to support his suspicions, and without evidence he couldn't act. But the tension between them continued to build, and Marie knew that eventually something would force a confrontation. That confrontation came in September of 1840, when a situation arose that Marie couldn't ignore, even though intervening would put her at serious risk. Thomas Beaumont, the lawyer's son, had married Catherine Hartwell in the spring of 1840. A union that had brought significant social and financial benefits to the Beaumont family. The Hartwells were one of the most prominent families in Vicksburg, with connections to banking, cotton trading, and state politics. The marriage had been carefully arranged, and both families had invested considerable effort in ensuring it went smoothly. But by September, Thomas had begun to show his true character. He visited the plantation regularly, ostensibly to handle legal matters for his father, but also to escape the scrutiny of his wife and her family in Vicksburg. And during those visits, he had begun to notice a girl named Ruth, who worked in the main house as a helper to the cook. Ruth was 16 years old, the daughter of Hannah, who managed the household linens. She was quiet and hardworking, trying to be invisible in the way that young enslaved women learned to be when they attracted the wrong kind of attention from men with power. But Thomas's attention, once focused, was difficult to escape. He began to find excuses to be in the kitchen when Ruth was working. He would make comments about her appearance, ask her questions that had nothing to do with her work, touch her arm or shoulder in ways that seemed casual but weren't. Hannah saw what was happening and was terrified. She knew what Thomas's attention meant, knew that Ruth had no way to refuse him without facing punishment, knew that if Thomas decided to act on his interests, there would be nothing she could do to protect her daughter. She came to Marie in desperation late one evening when the quarters were quiet. "He's going to ruin her," Hannah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can see it in the way he looks at her, the way he talks to her. It's only a matter of time before he decides to take what he wants, and there's nothing I can do. If I object, we'll both be sold. If Ruth resists, she'll be punished. Please, Marie, I know you can't stop him directly, but there has to be something. There has to be some way to protect her." Marie sat in silence for a long time, her mind working through possibilities and risks. This was different from her previous interventions. This involved the Beaumont family directly, not just overseers or business associates. This involved Thomas, who was educated, intelligent, and well-connected. The danger was exponentially higher. But she also knew that if she did nothing, Ruth would suffer and her own authority in the community would be meaningless. Information and intelligence were only powerful if they were used, even when the cost was high. "Tell me everything you know about Thomas Beaumont," Marie said finally. "His habits, his friends, his business dealings, his debts, his marriage, everything you've heard while working in the house." Over the next week, Hannah and other house slaves provided Marie with a detailed picture of Thomas Beaumont's life. The information they provided was extensive. Thomas was 26 years old, ambitious, and determined to make a name for himself in Mississippi politics. He saw his law practice as a stepping stone to a political career, possibly a seat in the state legislature or even Congress eventually. His marriage to Catherine Hartwell was crucial to those ambitions. The Hartwell family had money, connections, and social standing that Thomas needed. Catherine's father, William Hartwell, was a banker with influence in Vicksburg and connections throughout the state. Her uncle was a state senator. The marriage had been as much a business arrangement as a romantic union, but Thomas also had debts. He'd made poor investments in a cotton speculation scheme, the same scheme that had caused problems for his father. He'd lost money gambling in Vicksburg. He was living beyond his means, maintaining a lifestyle that required his father's financial support and the expectation of eventually accessing the Hartwell family wealth. Most importantly, Thomas had a reputation to maintain. He presented himself as a gentleman, a man of honor and refinement, someone worthy of the Hartwell family's trust and investment. Any scandal, any hint of impropriety could damage that reputation and jeopardize both his marriage and his political ambitions. Catherine's mother, Mrs. Hartwell, was known to be a woman of strong moral convictions who took her family's reputation seriously. She had been initially skeptical of Thomas, concerned that he was marrying Catherine for money rather than love, and she had made it clear that she would be watching his behavior carefully. Marie absorbed all of this information, turning it over in her mind, looking for leverage points. She couldn't confront Thomas directly. That would be suicidal. She couldn't tell Catherine about his intentions toward Ruth. A slave's word would never be believed over a white man's denial. She couldn't even ensure that Ruth was never alone with Thomas. He had the authority to order her presence whenever he wanted. But she could make Thomas aware that his actions were being observed and that those observations might reach people who could damage his reputation and his future. The plan she constructed was more complex and more dangerous than anything she'd attempted before. It required precise timing, multiple intermediaries, and a deep understanding of the social networks that connected the planter class. Marie began by ensuring that Ruth was never in a position where Thomas could approach her without witnesses. She arranged for Ruth's work schedule to be changed so that she was always in the kitchen when other people were present, never alone in rooms where Thomas might corner her. This was presented to patients as a matter of work efficiency. Ruth could learn more by working alongside experienced cooks, and having multiple people in the kitchen during busy times made the work go faster. Patients who had her own concerns about Thomas's behavior agreed to the change without questioning it too deeply. But Marie knew this was only a temporary solution. Thomas would eventually find another opportunity, or he would simply order Ruth to come to him privately. She needed to create a situation where Thomas would decide on his own that pursuing Ruth was too risky. The key was Mrs. Hartwell, Catherine's mother. If Mrs. Hartwell became concerned about Thomas's character, if she began to watch his behavior more carefully, if she made it clear to Thomas that any scandal would have consequences, then Thomas might reconsider his actions. But how could Marie, an enslaved woman with no access to the Hartwell family, influence Mrs. Hartwell's perceptions? The answer lay in the complex social networks that connected plantation families across the region. Information traveled through those networks constantly. Gossip, rumors, observations, concerns. If Marie could insert the right information into those networks, it would eventually reach Mrs. Hartwell through seemingly natural channels. Marie learned that Mrs. Hartwell was planning to visit Natchez in October to attend a series of social events. She would be staying with friends, the Chambers family, who owned a plantation about 10 miles from Beaumont. Marie began to cultivate a relationship with a slave named Peter, who worked for the Chambers family. She did this by sending herbs and remedies to the Chambers plantation, establishing herself as a resource for medical care. Peter, who suffered from chronic headaches, became a regular recipient of Marie's fever tea, and in return, he began to share information about the Chambers household. Through Peter, Marie learned about the social events Mrs. Hartwell would be attending, about the other families who would be present, about the topics of conversation that were likely to come up. And then she began to plant seeds of information that would grow into concerns about Thomas Beaumont's character. She started by having casual conversations with Peter about plantation life, about the challenges of working for families with young men who sometimes behaved inappropriately toward enslaved women. She never mentioned Thomas specifically, never made direct accusations, just general observations about how some young men of the planter class had habits that their wives' families might find troubling if they knew about them. Peter, understanding the subtext, began to have similar conversations with other slaves in the Chambers household. Those conversations, filtered through several people, eventually reached the Chambers family's house slaves, who mentioned them in the careful, indirect way that house slaves learn to communicate information to their owners. Mrs. Chambers, who was hosting Mrs. Artwellen, who wanted to ensure her guest was comfortable and well-informed, mentioned in casual conversation that she hoped Thomas Beaumont was treating Catherine well, that she'd heard some young men in the area had reputa. Shians for being less honorable than they appeared. Mrs. Hartwell, already protective of her daughter and already somewhat skeptical of Thomas, asked what Mrs. Chambers had heard. Mrs. Chambers, not wanting to make specific accusations without evidence, said only that she'd heard vague concerns, nothing concrete, probably nothing to worry about. But perhaps Mrs. Hartwell might want to observe Thomas more carefully during her visit, just to be certain he was the man he presented himself to be. This conversation, seemingly innocent, planted a seed of doubt in Mrs. Hartwell's mind. She began to pay more attention to Thomas's behavior, to ask Catherine questions about their marriage, to observe how Thomas interacted with others. Meanwhile, Marie had been working on another angle. She'd discovered that Thomas had been seen in Natchez at a gambling house on several occasions, losing money he couldn't afford to lose. This information came from slaves who worked in Natchez, who saw things that white society assumed were invisible to them. Marie ensured that this information also reached the social network, again through indirect channels. A slave who worked at the gambling house mentioned to a slave who worked for a merchant family that he'd seen Thomas Beaumont there several times, betting heavily. That information made its way through several conversations to reach the Chambers family, who mentioned it to Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell, now genuinely concerned, wrote to her husband in Vicksburg, expressing worry about Thomas's character and his treatment of their daughter. William Hartwell, who had invested significant resources in Thomas's career and who expected returns on that investment, decided to have a serious conversation with his son-in-law about expectations and behavior. That conversation, combined with Mrs. Hartwell's increased scrutiny, made Thomas acutely aware that his actions were being watched and that any scandal could jeopardize everything he'd worked for. At the same time, Marie arranged for Thomas to become aware that his interest in Ruth had been noticed. She did this through a carefully staged conversation that Thomas overheard while passing through the kitchen. Hannah was talking to patients, expressing concern about Ruth's safety, mentioning that she'd noticed one of the Beaumont family members paying inappropriate attention to her daughter. The conversation was loud enough for Thomas to hear, but not so loud that it seemed deliberately staged. It was presented as a private conversation between worried women, the kind of conversation that happened constantly in the quarters, but that white men rarely heard. Thomas, hearing this, realized that his interest in Ruth was not as invisible as he'd assumed. If the slaves were talking about it, there was a risk that the information could reach his wife, his in-laws, or the wider social network that determined his reputation. The combination of increased scrutiny from his mother-in-law, awareness that his behavior was being observed, and the risk of scandal made Thomas reconsider his intentions. He began to avoid the kitchen when Ruth was working, to focus his attention on his legal work and his political ambitions, to present himself as the honorable gentleman he claimed to be. Ruth, without ever knowing the complex web of information and influence that had been woven around her, found that Thomas's attention had shifted elsewhere. She remained safe, working in the kitchen, unaware of how close she'd come to disaster, and unaware of who had protected her. But Marie's intervention had not gone unnoticed by Cyrus Halt. He couldn't trace the specific mechanisms. The information was too diffuse, passed through too many hands, filtered through too many conversations. But he knew that something had happened, something that had protected Ruth from Thomas's attention, and he suspected that Marie was at the center of it. He had been watching Marie for months, looking for evidence of wrongdoing, and this situation confirmed his suspicions. She was too clever, too connected, too influential. She was manipulating events in ways that undermined the plantation's power structure, and that made her dangerous. In November of 1840, Hull made his move. He accused Marie of practicing witchcraft, of using supernatural means to influence events on the plantation. It was a serious accusation, one that could result in severe punishment or even execution. The accusation was based partly on superstition. Hull genuinely believed that Marie's influence was somehow unnatural, that no slave could be clever enough to do what he suspected she was doing without some kind of supernatural assistance. But it was also based on calculation. Witchcraft accusations were difficult to disprove, and they carried severe penalties. If Hull could make the accusation stick, he could eliminate Marie as a threat. The accusation was brought before Charles Beaumont, who was required by law to investigate any claims of witchcraft or rebellion among the enslaved population. Such accusations were taken seriously in the South, where the fear of slave rebellion was constant, and where any hint of supernatural influence was seen as potentially dangerous. Marie was brought to the main house on a cold November morning, standing before Beaumont and Hull in the library where so many decisions about her life and the lives of others had been made. The room was lined with books that represented knowledge and power, symbols of the education and authority that the planter class claimed as their exclusive right. Charles Beaumont sat behind his desk, looking at Marie with an expression that was difficult to read. An intelligent man, educated, capable of rational thought. But he was also a product of his time and place, someone who had been raised to believe that enslaved people were inferior, incapable of the kind of sophisticated thinking that Marie had been demonstrating. "These are serious accusations," Beaumont said, his voice grave. "Mr. Holt claims you've been using unnatural means to influence events on this plantation. He says that things happen around you that can't be explained by normal means, that you have knowledge you shouldn't have, that you influence outcomes in ways that suggest supernatural power. What do you say to these charges?" Marie kept her eyes lowered, her posture respectful, her voice quiet. She had prepared for this moment, had known it would come eventually. Everything depended on how she handled the next few minutes. "Sir, I am an herb woman," she said carefully. "I grow plants and make remedies as I was instructed to do when I came to this plantation. I know which herbs help with fever, which ones ease pain, which ones can be made into pices for wounds. My grandmother taught me these things when I was young, and I've practiced them all my life. But I know nothing of witchcraft or unnatural things. I only do the work I was given." Holt says people come to you for more than remedies. Beaumont said that you give them counsel, that things change after they speak with you, that you seem to know things you shouldn't know, that you influence events you shouldn't be able to influence. "People talk to me, sir." "Yes," Marie admitted. "They talk about their troubles the way people do when they're sick or hurting. When your body is in pain, your mind is troubled too. And sometimes people need to talk about their worries as much as they need medicine. I listen because listening is part of healing. My grandmother taught me that too." "And do you give them advice?" Beaumont asked. "Sometimes, sir, if they ask, but only simple advice, the kind anyone might give. If someone is worried about being accused of something, I might suggest they talk to the overseer and explain their side. If someone is concerned about a family member, I might suggest they talk to you or Mrs. Beaumont if the matter is serious. I have no power to change anything myself. I'm just a slave who tends plants and listens to people's troubles." It was a perfect answer, humble, reasonable, impossible to disprove, impossible. She presented herself as someone who was skilled in a narrow area, but who had no understanding of the larger power structures, someone who gave only the most basic advice that any person might give. Holt's face wrined with frustration. "She's lying," he said. "She's manipulating people. She knows things she shouldn't know. She influences things she shouldn't be able to influence. She's too clever by half." "Being clever is not the same as practicing witchcraft," Beaumont said mildly. "Intelligence is not supernatural." "But she's a slave," Hull protested. Slaves aren't supposed to be that intelligent. Beaumont looked at him with an expression that suggested he found this argument unconvincing. I've known many intelligent slaves, Mr. Holt. Intelligence is not limited to any particular race or condition. Marie is clearly intelligent, and she's clearly skilled at her work. But that doesn't mean she's practicing witchcraft. He turned back to Marie. Do you read and write? It was a dangerous question. Literacy was illegal for slaves in Mississippi. Admitting to it could result in punishment, but denying it when Beaumont might already have evidence would be equally dangerous. I can read some, sir, Marie admitted carefully. My previous owner in Louisiana allowed it so I could read receipts for herb orders and keep records of remedies. I know it's not allowed here, and I haven't taught anyone else. I only use it for my work to keep track of which plants I have and which remedies I've made and write. I can make marks to help me remember things, sir. I don't know if that counts as proper writing. Beaumont nodded slowly. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out Marie's leather journal, the one she kept hidden in her cabin. Marie's heart sank. Someone had searched her belongings and found it. This is yours? Beaumont asked, holding up the journal. Yes, sir. What's in it? Recipes for remedies, sir. Notes about which plants grow well together, which ones need more water or more sun, things my grandmother taught me that I wanted to remember. Beaumont opened the journal and looked at the pages. Marie had been careful about what she wrote. The journal did contain recipes and plant notes exactly as she'd said, but it also contained observations about the plantation's operations, about patterns she'd noticed, about people and their relationships. She'd written these observations in a kind of code, using plant names and gardening metaphors to disguise their true meaning. To someone who didn't know the code, it would look like nothing more than an herb woman's notes. But to someone who understood what they were looking at, it would reveal the sophisticated intelligence network Marie had built. Beaumont read several pages, his expression thoughtful. Marie couldn't tell if he understood what he was seeing or if he saw only plant notes. Finally, he closed the journal and set it on his desk. I find no evidence of witchcraft here, he said. These are notes about plants and remedies exactly as Marie described. She is literate and intelligent, qualities that make her valuable in her role as her woman. As long as she continues to perform her duties and causes no direct trouble, I see no reason to punish her. He turned to Hole. Your concerns are noted, Mr. Holt, but I will not act on suspicion alone. If you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, evidence of rebellion, of theft, of deliberate sabotage, bring it to me and I will act. But intelligence and literacy are not crimes, and I will not punish a valuable slave for being clever. It was a reprieve, but Marie understood it was also a warning. Beaumont had essentially told her that he knew what she was doing, or at least suspected it, and that he would tolerate it only as long as it didn't threaten his interests directly. She had been given a boundary, and crossing it would have consequences. You may return to your work, Beaumont said to Marie, but understand that you are being watched. If I have reason to believe you are causing trouble, I will not be as lenient next time. Yes, sir, Marie said quietly. Thank you, sir. She left the library, her journal still sitting on Beaumont's desk. She didn't ask for it back. That would seem too bold. She would have to start a new one and be even more careful about what she wrote and where she kept it. But she had survived the confrontation, and that was what mattered. Marie adjusted her methods after that encounter. She became even more careful, even more selective about when and how she intervened. She focused on situations where the outcome would benefit the enslaved population without directly threatening the plantation's operations or the Beaumont family's interests. She also began to train others in her methods, teaching them how to observe, how to gather information, how to plant seeds of influence. She did this carefully, working with people she trusted completely, people who understood the risks and who had the intelligence and patience to use the methods effectively. Denina became one of her students, learning how to gather information from the main house and how to pass it along through trusted channels. Hannah learned how to observe patterns in the Beaumont family's behavior and how to anticipate their decisions. Peter at the Chambers plantation became a node in a wider network that connected enslaved people across multiple plantations in the region. Marie was building something larger than herself, creating a network that could function even if she was sold or punished or killed. She was teaching people that intelligence and information were weapons, that resistance didn't always look like rebellion, that power could be challenged through subtle means that left no evidence. But she also began to think about something more ambitious: freedom, not escape. Escape was dangerous and often unsuccessful, and it left behind everyone who couldn't escape, but legal freedom achieved through the mechanisms that the system itself provided. Marie had learned that there were legal processes by which enslaved people could sometimes purchase their freedom or be manumitted by their owners. These processes were rare and difficult to access, but they existed. In Louisiana, the laws were somewhat more flexible than in Mississippi. Free people of color could own property, run businesses, even own slaves themselves. There were communities of free black people in New Orleans and other cities. People who had achieved freedom through various means and who sometimes helped others achieve it. Marie began to gather information about these processes, about the legal requirements, about the costs, about the people who might be able to help. She did this through the networks she'd built, through conversations with slaves who had connections to free black communities, through careful observation of legal documents that Thomas Beaumont left scattered in the library. And she began to think about how she might achieve freedom, not just for herself, but for others. In 1841, Marie learned that Charles Beaumont was facing serious financial difficulties. The cotton market had been unstable for several years, with prices fluctuating wildly based on factors that planters couldn't control: weather, international trade, speculation by cotton brokers. Beaumont had made investments based on the assumption that prices would remain high, but instead they'd fallen, and now he had debts that were becoming difficult to manage. Marie learned this through multiple sources. She heard conversations between Charles and Eleanor Beaumont overheard by house slaves and passed along through the network. She saw correspondence from creditors glimpsed while cleaning the library. She heard Thomas discussing his father's financial situation with Catherine during one of their visits. The situation was serious enough that Beaumont was considering selling some of his enslaved population to raise capital. This was a crisis for the entire community. Sales meant families separated, people sent to plantations where conditions might be far worse. The network Marie had built scattered to the winds. Marie began to gather information about Beaumont's financial situation with systematic precision. She learned the names of his creditors, the amounts he owed, the timeline for payment. She learned about his assets, his land holdings, his business partnerships. She learned about the cotton market, about prices and trends, about which brokers were reliable and which were not. She gathered this information from dozens of sources: conversations overheard by house slaves, documents glimpsed by those who cleaned the library and the plantation office, casual comments made by visitors to the plantation, information passed along by slaves from other plantations who were connected to the network. And then she began to look for leverage, for ways to help Beaumont solve his financial problems without selling slaves. She discovered that one of Beaumont's major creditors, a banker named Sutton in Natchez, had recently been involved in a scandal involving fraudulent land sales. The scandal hadn't become public yet, but rumors were circulating in certain business circles. Sutton had been selling land that he didn't actually own, or that had unclear titles to investors who didn't know enough to check the records carefully. Several people had lost money, and there was talk of legal action. Marie also discovered that Sutton was desperate to maintain his reputation and would be vulnerable to pressure from anyone who threatened to expose his dealings. But Marie couldn't use this information directly. She had no standing, no voice in the business world. She needed to ensure that the information reached someone who did have that standing, someone who would be motivated to use it against Sutton. She learned that there was a rival banker in Natchez, a man named Prescott, who had been competing with Sutton for influence in the region. Prescott was ambitious, ruthless, and always looking for opportunities to undermine his competitors through a complex chain of communication involving multiple intermediaries. Marie arranged for information about Sutton's fraudulent dealings to reach Prescott. The information was presented as a rumor overheard by a slave who worked in Sutton's household. passed along through the informal networks that connected enslaved people across different plantations and businesses. The chain worked like this. Marie told Peter, who worked at the Chambers plantation, that she'd heard rumors about questionable land deals in Natchez. Peter mentioned this to a slave who worked for a merchant family in Natchez. That slave mentioned it to another slave who worked in Sutton's household, asking if there was any truth to the rumors. That slave, who had indeed seen documents related to the fraudulent sales, confirmed that yes, there seemed to be problems with some of Sutton's land deals. This confirmation made its way back through the chain, gaining credibility with each retelling. Eventually, the information reached a free black man in Natchez who had business connections to Prescott's bank. This man, seeing an opportunity to gain favor with Prescott, mentioned the rumors to one of Prescott's associates. Prescott investigated the rumors and found them to be true. He then saw an opportunity to both damage his rival and expand his own business. He approached several of Sutton's clients, including Charles Beaumont, with an offer. He would provide them with loans on favorable terms to pay off their debts to Sutton, and in exchange they would shift their banking business to Prescott's institution. Beaumont, seeing an opportunity to escape his financial difficulties without selling his slaves, accepted the offer. Prescott provided a loan that allowed Beaumont to pay off his debts, and in return, Beaumont agreed to use Prescott's bank for future transactions and to give Prescott a share in the next cotton harvest. The crisis was averted. The enslaved population at Beaumont Plantation remained intact. No families were separated, and no one except Marie knew that she had orchestrated
the entire sequence of events.
That she had identified the leverage point, constructed the chain of communication, and ensured that the right information reached the right person at the right time. To everyone else, it appeared to be nothing more than fortunate timing and business competition. Over the next 3 years, from 1841 to 1844, Marie continued her work with increasing sophistication. She intervened in dozens of situations, protecting people, preventing separations, mitigating punishments. She became a legend in the enslaved community, not just at Beaumont, but across the region as word of her methods spread through the networks that connected plantations. But she also began to use her influence for something more ambitious, facilitating freedom. Marie had learned that there were several mechanisms by which enslaved people could achieve legal freedom. First, manumission by the owner, where the owner voluntarily freed a slave, usually in recognition of long service or special circumstances. This was rare but not unheard of. Second, self-purchase, where a slave who had been allowed to earn money could buy their own freedom. This required the owner's cooperation and was only possible in states like Louisiana, where the laws allowed it. Third, purchased by a free person of color, where someone who was already free would buy a slave with the intention of freeing them. This was sometimes done by family members or by free black communities that worked to help enslaved people achieve freedom. Fourth, legal challenges based on technicalities in ownership or sale documents. This was rare and difficult, but occasionally someone would discover that their enslavement was legally questionable and could challenge it in court. Marie began to identify people who might be candidates for freedom through one of these mechanisms. She looked for people who had skills that made them valuable enough that an owner might consider allowing self-purchase. She looked for people who had connections to free black communities in Louisiana or other states. She looked for people whose enslavement might have legal vulnerabilities. And then she began to create situations where freedom became possible. For a man named Daniel who had exceptional carpentry skills, Marie arranged for him to do work for several prominent families in Natchez, building a reputation that made him valuable enough that Beaumont might consider allowing him to purchase his freedom. She did this by mentioning his skills to house slaves who worked for those families who mentioned them to their employers, who then requested Daniel's services from Beaumont. Daniel's work was so impressive that several families offered to pay premium prices for his services. Beaumont, seeing an opportunity to profit, began to hire Daniel out regularly, allowing Daniel to keep a small percentage of his earnings. Over several years, Daniel saved enough money to make an offer to purchase his freedom, Beaumont, who by this time had resolved his financial difficulties and who saw Daniel as more valuable as a free craftsman who could be hired as needed rather than as a slave who had to be maintained, agreed to the purchase. Daniel became a free man in 1843 at the age of 35. For a woman named Esther who had saved money from selling vegetables from her garden plot. Marie helped her navigate the legal process of manumission by ensuring that information about the process reached her through a free black woman in Natchez who had connections to lawyers willing to handle such cases. Esther had been saving money for years, selling vegetables and eggs to other slaves and occasionally to white families in the area. She had accumulated nearly $200, a significant sum, but she didn't know how to approach Beaumont about purchasing freedom. Didn't know what the legal process required, didn't know if it was even possible. Maria arranged for Esther to meet with the free black woman whose name was Hella during a trip to Natchez to sell vegetables. Elaine explained the legal process, connected Esther with a lawyer who could draw up the necessary documents, and helped her prepare a proposal to present to Beaumont. The proposal was carefully crafted to appeal to Beaumont's financial interests. Esther offered not just the $200 she'd saved, but also a promise to continue providing vegetables to the plantation at reduced prices for the next 5 years. The total value of the offer was approximately $400, which was reasonable for a woman of Esther's age and skills. Beaumont, who was in a more financially stable position by 1844 and who appreciated Esther's years of reliable service, agreed to the manumission. Esther became a free woman, though she continued to live in the area and maintain her connections to the enslaved community. Each case took months or years of careful work, but gradually people began to achieve freedom through legal means that left no trail back to Marie's involvement. By 1844, Marie herself had saved enough money from selling herbs and remedies to begin considering her own freedom. She had been allowed to keep a small percentage of the money she earned from selling remedies to white families in the area, and over 5 years she had accumulated nearly $300. But she also understood that her value to the community was in her position at Beaumont, where she had access to information and influence. Leaving would mean abandoning the network she'd built, the people she'd been protecting. It was a choice between personal freedom and collective power. And for a long time, Marie couldn't decide which path to take. The decision was made for her in the spring of 1845 when Cyrus Hole, who had never stopped suspecting Marie of subversion, finally found evidence he thought he could use against her. One of Marie's intermediaries, a man named Benjamin, who carried messages between plantations, was caught with a letter that contained information about slave sales and plantation finances. Benjamin worked as a driver, transporting goods between plantations, which gave him legitimate reasons to travel and made him valuable as a courier for the network. But in March of 1845, he was stopped on the road by a patrol that was looking for runaway slaves. The patrol searched his wagon and found the letter hidden among his belongings. The letter was coded using the same kind of plant metaphors that Marie used in her journal, but it was clear enough that it contained information about business dealings that a slave shouldn't have access to. Under interrogation, Benjamin revealed that he'd been gathering information at Marie's request, though he claimed not to know what she did with it or why she wanted it. Hull, who had been waiting for years for evidence against Marie, saw this as his opportunity. He brought the letter and Benjamin's testimony to Beaumont, arguing that Marie was organizing some kind of intelligence network among the enslaved population, gathering information that could be used for rebellion or escape. This time, Beaumont couldn't ignore the accusation. The evidence was too concrete, the implications too serious. The letter proved that Marie was gathering information about plantation finances and slave sales, information that she had no legitimate reason to have. And Benjamin's testimony confirmed that Marie was directing this information gathering. Marie was arrested and held in the plantation jail, while Beaumont decided what to do with her. The enslaved community was terrified. Marie had been their protector, their strategist, their hope. Without her, they would be vulnerable to the full force of the plantation's power structure. People who had relied on her counsel, people who had been saved by her interventions, people who had learned her methods. All of them feared what would happen now. But Marie had prepared for this possibility. Over the years, she had trained others in her methods, had taught them how to observe, how to gather information, how to plant seeds of influence. She had created a network that could function without her, though not as effectively. And she had one final card to play. From her cell in the plantation jail, Marie sent a message through the network she'd built. The message was carried by Diner, who had been one of Marie's most trusted students. It reached Thomas Beaumont in Vicksburg, where he was now established as a successful lawyer with growing political ambitions. The message contained information about a case Thomas was working on, a complex property dispute that had been stalled for months. One of Thomas's clients was trying to prove ownership of a piece of land that had been sold multiple times with unclear titles. The case depended on finding documentation that proved the chain of ownership, but that documentation had been missing. Marie's network had discovered where that documentation was hidden. It was in the possession of the opposing party's lawyer, who had deliberately concealed it to prevent Thomas's client from proving their case. The message told Thomas exactly where to find the documents and how to obtain them legally through a court order. The message also contained a proposal if Thomas would intervene on Marie's behalf, arguing that she was too valuable to punish severely and should instead be sold to a more lenient owner in Louisiana. The information about the documents would be provided to him in detail. If he refused, the information would be destroyed and his case would remain as stalled, possibly resulting in a loss that would damage his reputation. It was blackmail, pure and simple, but it was blackmail based on offering value rather than threatening harm. Thomas would gain something concrete, a significant legal victory that would enhance his reputation in exchange for a relatively small favor. Thomas, who was ambitious and pragmatic, recognized the opportunity. He also recognized that Marie was far too intelligent and dangerous to keep in Mississippi, where she might continue to cause problems for the planter class, but selling her to Louisiana, where the laws were different and where she might eventually achieve freedom, would remove the threat while also providing value to his father. He traveled to Beaumont Plantation and made his case to his father. He argued that Marie was indeed too intelligent and valuable to waste through punishment. Executing her or selling her to a brutal owner would be a loss of valuable property. But selling her to a contact he had in New Orleans, a free black woman named Helen, who ran a boarding house and needed someone with Marie's skills, would be more profitable and would remove the source of trouble from the plantation. Charles Beaumont, who was tired of the complications Marie had caused and who saw the financial sense in Thomas's argument, agreed. Marie was sold to Helen in New Orleans for $1,000, a price that reflected her skills and intelligence. The sale was completed in June of 1845. Marie was transported to New Orleans, leaving behind the network she'd built, the people she'd protected, the community that had come to depend on her. But she had also left behind something more important, a method, a way of thinking, a set of techniques that others could use. The network continued to function after her departure, less effectively, but still present, still gathering information, still planting seeds of
influence, still resisting in ways that left no evidence.
Marie arrived in New Orleans in late June of 1845, and her life changed completely. The city was different from anything she'd experienced in Mississippi. Larger, more diverse, with a significant population of free people of color who had their own businesses, their own communities, their own forms of power. Helen, the free black woman who had purchased her, was part of a network of free people of color who worked to help enslaved people gain freedom through legal means. The purchase had been arranged specifically to get Marie out of Mississippi and into a situation where she could eventually purchase her own freedom. Helen ran a boarding house in the French Quarter that catered to free people of color and to white clients who were comfortable with the city's more relaxed racial boundaries. She needed someone with Marie's skills to manage the household, to provide medical care for boarders, and to help run the business. The arrangement was clear from the beginning. Marie would work for Helen, earning a salary that would allow her to save money toward purchasing her freedom. The price was set at $1,000, the amount Hella had paid for her, plus interest. It would take time, but it was achievable. Marie threw herself into the work with the same systematic efficiency she'd brought to everything else. She managed the boarding house, tended to sick boarders, cultivated an herb garden in the courtyard, and began to build new networks in New Orleans. She also continued the work she'd been doing in Mississippi, but in a different context. New Orleans had a large population of enslaved people and free people of color, and there were constant opportunities to help people navigate the path to freedom. Marie began to connect with other free people of color who were working towards similar goals. She met lawyers who specialized
and manumission cases.
She met former slaves who had purchased their freedom and were now helping others do the same. She met activists who were working within the legal system to expand the rights of free people of color. And she began to document the methods she'd developed over the years, the techniques of observation, information gathering, and strategic influence that had allowed her to protect people and facilitate freedom. She wrote these methods down in a new journal, more detailed and systematic than the one Beaumont had confiscated. She described how to observe power structures, how to identify leverage points, how to gather information without being noticed, how to plant information through trusted intermediaries, how to create change without leaving evidence. She wrote about specific cases, analyzing what had worked and what hadn't, identifying principles that could be applied in different contexts. She wrote about the psychology of power, about how people in authority made decisions, about how to influence those decisions without direct confrontation. She wrote about networks, about how to build them, how to maintain them, how to use them to gather and distribute information. She wrote about trust, about how to earn it and how to maintain it, about how to identify people who could be trusted with dangerous knowledge. She wrote about patience, about how change often took months or years, about how to maintain hope and determination when progress seemed impossible. The journal became a kind of manual for resistance, a textbook for using intelligence and information as weapons against oppression. Within 2 years, Marie had earned enough money to purchase her freedom. She became a free woman in 1847 at the age of 31, but she didn't stop the work she'd been doing. Instead, she expanded it. Using the network she'd built in Mississippi and the new connections she'd made in New Orleans, Marie became a facilitator of freedom for others. She gathered information about enslaved people who were candidates for manumission, connected them with lawyers and free black sponsors, and helped navigate the complex legal processes that made freedom possible. She also began to share her journal with others, copying sections and distributing them through trusted networks. The journal was passed from person to person, copied and recopied, its methods adapted and applied in different contexts across the South. It became an underground textbook for resistance, teaching people how to use intelligence and information as weapons against the system that oppressed them. The method spread, adapted, evolved, becoming part of the toolkit that enslaved people used to resist and survive. Marie Laveau lived in New Orleans for the rest of her life, working as a healer and herbalist, but also as a quiet organizer and strategist for the cause of freedom. She never became famous in the way that some abolitionists did. Her methods required secrecy, and her effectiveness depended on remaining in the shadows. But by the time she died in 1881 at the age of 65, she had helped facilitate the freedom of more than 200 people through legal manumission. She had trained dozens of others in her methods of strategic resistance. She had created networks of information and influence that continued to operate long after her death. The story of Marie Laveau, the Mississippi slave, was deliberately obscured by history. The Voodoo Queen legend that grew up around a different Marie Laveau in New Orleans, a free woman of color who lived at the same time and who did practice voodoo, became the dominant narrative, overshadowing the real story of the enslaved woman who had used intelligence and information as tools of liberation. This obscuring was not accidental. The story of Marie the S.L. Ave was dangerous to the narratives that America wanted to tell about slavery. It revealed that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active resistors who used sophisticated methods to undermine the system that oppressed them. It showed that resistance didn't always look like rebellion, that intelligence and patience could be as powerful as violence. It also revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, that it depended on information and perception, and that those who controlled information could influence outcomes even when they had no formal authority. The schools didn't teach this story because it complicated the simple narratives they preferred, the narrative of helpless slaves waiting for white saviors, or the narrative of violent rebellion as the only form of resistance. Marie's story didn't fit either template. She was neither helpless nor violent. She was strategic, patient, and devastatingly effective. Her methods were documented in that journal, which survived in fragments in various archives. The pages were scattered across different collections, often mislabeled or attributed to others. Some sections were dismissed as apocryphal, as folklore rather than historical fact. But the techniques described in those pages, the systematic gathering of information, the strategic planting of influence, the patient construction of networks, those techniques were real, and they were used by countless people whose names were never recorded. Marie Laveau's legacy was not in supernatural powers or mystical practices. It was in the demonstration that knowledge carefully applied could dismantle systems of oppression from within. That intelligence was a weapon, that patience was a strategy, that freedom could be built one careful intervention at a time. The Mississippi slave Marie Laveau understood something that America has always been reluctant to acknowledge, that the enslaved were not objects acted upon by history, but agents who shaped history through methods that were subtle, sophisticated, and far more dangerous to the established order than any rebellion. That's why her story was refused a place in textbooks. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true. And the truth it revealed threatened every comfortable assumption about power, resistance, and who is allowed to shape history. The woman who tended herbs in a Mississippi plantation garden and altered the futures of hundreds, not through force, but through observation, patience, and precisely chosen words. That woman posed a greater threat to the system than any army ever could. And that is exactly why her story never appeared in classrooms. The real Marie Laveau, the one history intentionally smudged out of the record, demonstrated that the most radical form of resistance is often the one that leaves almost no trace, the kind that moves quietly within the machinery of oppression, loosening its bolts from the inside, the kind that uses the master's own tools not to stage a dramatic demolition, but to quietly unfasten every lock, unlatch every window, and weaken the structure until collapse becomes inevitable. Her story is a reminder that history is not merely written by the victors. It is curated, edited, and sanitized by those who fear what the full truth might inspire. Because if people ever fully understood that knowledge could be a weapon, that strategy could be more powerful than violence, that an entire system could be undone by the very people it sought to suppress, then every oppressive order would suddenly find itself vulnerable in ways it could never defend against. That is the story they refused to teach, not because it was false, but because it was dangerously true. And truth, as always, is the most subversive thing of all.